Out in the world somewhere, there are around 10 million people who know about a group of people known as Rocket Jump. Some of you hear that name and think, oh, I remember them, and others only remember them when I say the words video game high school. If that's the phrase that caught your attention, by the way, then you gotta pack it up, Unc. For a while, this group was known for some of the highest quality videos on all of YouTube, but over time, one of the biggest contributors to the channel, Brandon JLA, would leave to focus on other things. It's no secret that Brandon absolutely loves the CGI and gaming side of things, with lots of his old content focusing on very technical topics such as how YouTube compression works, and gaming topics where he bets on if the PS3 or Xbox 360 would sell more by the end of the lifespan, and winds up being right.
I've got a long-standing bet with Nico. It's my longest standing bet, dating back to 2009, where I bet him that the PS3 would sell more consoles lifetime than the Xbox 360. And now, at the time of this bet, the 360 was vastly in the lead and everything, and the PS3 was selling less consoles on a week-to-week basis and everything. But lo and behold, old Brandon was right.
So naturally, Brandon's next big project in his life would be something along these lines, and with hindsight, it couldn't have been more obvious than the push to virtual reality. At this time in the VR scene, modern games consist of the iconic floating hands, stationary gameplay, and was only just recently introduced to controllers that were able to track your hands. All of which, by the way, could only be accomplished by owning a very powerful PC, which could cost upwards of $1,000 and a VR headset, with the cheapest option at the time being $700 if you wanted full hand presence. Because of this reason, VR to many developers didn't look all too appealing to them. With such a high barrier to entry, making VR games simply wasn't a bet worth taking, let alone worth innovating in. This is a problem that would later be alleviated to some degree by the PlayStation VR, but even then, VR was still simply not viewed as a worthy investment for many developers. Brandon JLA was around for the very early days of YouTube and sees VR in a similar fashion.
Things we want to do with VR and looking at it as a medium that's similar to YouTube was when we found it in 2010. That's like a nascent medium that we can kind of formulate and try to push in whatever direction we want it to go.
So with Brandon being probably one of the only people with the team willing to bite the bullet on VR for the promise of its future, and being the only group willing to innovate, they dived right in and made another 2016 modern VR game with floating hands and stationary gameplay. Hover Junkers was SLZ's first major release in the virtual reality scene, and dumbing it down to just another 2016 VR game was a bit harsh, considering it was the first VR game to properly showcase that multiplayer can be done in VR. The game was very featureful, received a good handful of updates, and was ultimately a solid VR title for its time. I could probably do an entire video about Hover Junkers at some point, as there is more to SLZ's backstory than I've given so far, but for this video, we're gonna skip a little bit past Hover Junkers, as it isn't too important for this video in particular. SLZ has always had a specific goal with their VR titles, and that is to prove something is possible within the medium with each release. With Hover Junkers, Brandon and his team, SLZ, went out to prove that you can make a multiplayer VR game, which, believe it or not, at the time was something not really concrete. Nowadays, most VR games have multiplayer, but back then, it was a lot more foreign of a concept, as VR was extremely new. Hover Junkers was very successful in its mission to prove multiplayer as a viable concept in VR, paving the way for games like Pavlov in the future. With one thing proven, however, it was time for Stress Level Zero to work on their next big project, and this time, SLZ was setting out to prove that narrative story games could be done in VR. Duck Season is a game by SLZ, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It was their first call to fame, and my first time seeing a game by SLZ when I was watching GT Live play it before I could afford a gaming PC or VR headset. Duck Season was a really great game, with a story I found so interesting I still, to this day, eagerly await the next SLZ game to feature that damn dog, or explain what happened to the main character you play as, David. And no, a stupid-ass Bone Lab avatar does not count. For all the great things Duck Season does very well, there's a lot under the hood that I feel has gone greatly underappreciated and would be the foundation of their next VR game. Brandon JLA has a strong feeling towards how a VR game should feel, and a big part of that comes from his personal experience with Airsoft and experiences with other games. A big part of why things such as guns feel so great in future titles comes from the strong sense Brandon has for these sort of things.
We're into guns. We kind of made it our personal mission to try to make VR guns as good as possible. I mean, and really what it is, we're trying to take these and figure out how to make it into a gun.
So with this incredible philosophy and great mindset towards how to tackle the gun problem in VR, Brendan and his team went on to make one of the best feeling shotguns in VR. But it definitely still had a lot of work to be done. For some, the shotgun felt great and responsive, but for others, it was a nightmare. The shotgun doesn't allow you to grip it with two hands via a button press, so you have to put your hand in the correct position to get the character to grip the shotgun. This goes against the sort of natural feeling of aiming how you want, and instead required the user to aim how the game basically forces you to. You could make the argument of, well, that's how you're supposed to hold the gun. But when the gun isn't really there, it's a lot harder to sort of feel how you're supposed to hold something. Regardless though, SLZ would seemingly take notes of these things and apply them the next chance they got. Duck Season was a very featureful game, including a full campaign, a magnum fuck ton of Easter eggs, and most notably, teasers towards their upcoming games. Duck Season seemed to hint that the next game by Stress Level Zero would be Hall of the Machine King, with a bunch of concept art shown. But another game they slightly teased at was a title called Boneworks, which would wind up becoming the next game by the studio. I believe that Hall of the Machine King was supposed to be the next game, but similarly to how SLZ believes the technology for B-side isn't there yet in a future title, I think the same thing applied for Hall of the Machine King, resulting in Boneworks being made before it. So with Duck Season being a fully finished product after receiving a good handful of updates, it was time for Stress Level Zero to put a little bow on it and begin work on the next project. This time, they were going to prove the importance of physics-based interactions in VR. Boneworks development took somewhere around 2 years, and the first official bit of info we ever saw regarding its development came from a video from Node, where they showcased what they call the best VR guns ever made. They also had a playable demo at GDC that we still don't have to this day, although Test Chamber 04 in Bone Lab is built off the same environment, albeit with some changes. The whole focus was showing that everything in the game was dictated via physics, and was also one of the first showcases of two-handed guns in VR, but definitely not the first ever, because at this time we already had games like Pavlov.
So you're telling me you've gone out to code the best VR guns?
That's the goal, the best VR guns.
There's a Half-Life gravity gun on the table in this demo, so now seems like an important time to mention a video some of you may be familiar with from Tyler McVicker on how Boneworks was planned to be a Half-Life game, to which Valve declined. There's a lot of information suggesting this may be false, and Tyler himself even going as far to unlist the video, so that rumor seems to be untrue. However, what we do know for sure is that Valve most definitely took a look at Boneworks and must have liked it a whole hell of a lot, because it would later show up on the Steam master list for somewhere around 6 months, right next to big Valve titles like Portal and Half-Life. After SLZ showcased what they had in the works to Valve, Valve would go on to give them prototype Valve Index controllers, codenamed the Knuckles, so that they could build Boneworks with support for them. This is part of the reason why Boneworks is still probably the best supported Index game, even when compared to Half-Life Alyx, which is literally made by Valve. Boneworks would wind up a much different game than what was being worked on at this time. For example, here we have Jimmy Wong speaking to you head to head, something that wouldn't be in an SLZ game until Bone Lab's release.
Is that face capture? iPhone face capture?
That's capture with an iPhone.
At this point, the reason things like a full body and spectator cam were basically finished was so that Boneworks could be shown in a video format for the sake of showcasing things to AAA studios.
So the rules of this game, to set up what this is, so basically, I always complain a lot about what the AAA developers have been doing and what they've been making. They kind of make the same thing over and over again. They iterate a little bit, and there's a reason for that, because they're trying to keep the shareholders happy. But they leave it to guys like us to actually innovate. They leave it to guys like us to invent something new, because they want it to be proven before they're going to invest their money in it. So that's okay. We got you, AAAs.
Also, interestingly, what would be the redacted chamber in a later update to Boneworks was originally Test Chamber 04, and selecting the chamber would be done with a little ball mechanism. That same ball would later be used for the body log in Bone Lab. The game also originally had you playing as Jimmy Wong, and to this day, we still don't have an SLZ game where you play as him. And no, a dumb fucking Bone Lab model doesn't count. It was very clear that at this point, Boneworks had a bit of an identity crisis. The main characters switched twice, once from Safety Steve, then to Jimmy Wong. The original test chamber was completely redesigned, and the only enemy made so far wouldn't even wind up being used in the final game at all. At this point in development, it was basically just a core system, with the newest addition being body holsters. The game started out as just a core technology, and it might not have even been intended to become a game at all, but some internal talks later, and it was decided that Boneworks would become a narrative story game with a full campaign to play through, throwing away Jimmy Wong as the main character, the Half-Life fan game style, and even removing the test chambers that were basically the only environments in Boneworks at the time. It was time for Boneworks to become its own game, so the team hired Michael Wyckoff again for the soundtrack after his amazing work on Duck Season and Hover Junkers, and got to work on building a story and world, all based around a virtual simulation known as MythOS. Many months of development later, and the game was almost ready for release, but there was just one problem. The levels were deemed too short by the team. The whole game was beaten in a way shorter time than expected, and as such worried the team that people would complain that the game simply wasn't long enough. But with not enough time left to go back and rework the game, it was time to lock in and get ready for the release anyways. With at least 2 years of hard work, an advanced physics core, and an entire campaign, it was finally time for Stress Level 0 to see if the fruits of their labor would pay off. Boneworks was finally available to the public, and the game was a smash hit. Easily the most popular VR title out at the moment, and people were loving it. Even beyond just VR fans, people all over the world had this interest in Boneworks and VR just based off some of the crazy things people were doing in the game with the physics. The game was topping Steam charts, and it absolutely deserved it. This game was the only game ever made that made you feel like you really embody this character in this world. You weren't just watching a character on a screen respond to your clicks. You were physically swinging your arms to avoid getting jumped by crablets. You weren't phasing through walls without arms or legs. You were a physical being that could genuinely struggle to pick up things due to a lack of strength, have intense fights where you could smash enemies against walls and objects, and it felt like you were really in this world, and that's because, in a way, you were. The philosophies and ideas mentioned earlier is why Boneworks feels so real. It tries replicating genuine rules of the world you're used to and implementing them into a virtual world. The great mindsets of being able to force grab things because, as stated by Brandon himself, VR should be better than the real world, is why this game made people feel like some sort of superhuman. After I played this game and went to class the next day, I had this surreal moment where I dropped a marker on the floor, and me and my friend, who both stayed up all night playing the game, reached our hands out and genuinely, unironically, tried to force grab just based on pure instinct. There's two ways to look at that. On one hand, holy shit, a game being that enthralling that it has a physical effect the next day is ridiculous. And on the other hand, holy shit, how much of a super virgin do you have to be to pick up on habits by playing a fucking VR game? Seriously though, the release of this game alone changed the way many saw VR, me included. It ruined other titles for me in a lot of ways. I remember trying to play Pavlov the next day and really struggling since the guns simply didn't respond as excellently as they did in Boneworks. These mechanics would be nothing without levels to go with it, and Boneworks delivered. The first level of the game is called Break Room, and it is literally just a break room where you go from point A to point B. This is to help the player get familiar with how to move and begin getting used to the physical interaction of the world, along with learning how to force grab. Immediately after, the player is hit with what I believe is the greatest tutorial in all of gaming, the museum. The museum is filled with interaction after interaction, teaching the player how to play the game in a way that goes at the player's pace. There's no unskippable cutscenes, no mandatory puzzles that take more than 13% of brain power, and instead, the player can choose how long they want to spend on each segment. My first playthrough of Museum took me somewhere around 2 hours just being in pure awe at all the fun and creative interactions you could have. Some people did it faster, some people took longer. But regardless, due to its design, players usually would never be annoyed by the length, because if they didn't want it to take long, they could just run straight to the end. The next level is Streets, and it introduces you to the first enemy of the game, the Null Bodies. These are the generic enemies of the game that basically just attack you when they see you. This level also introduces you to the Omni Projectors, although you don't actually face them head to head yet. The next level, Runoff, has you actually fight these Omnis, and their special feature is that they have ranged weapons to shoot at you. Later in the level, you're also introduced to your first head crablet, which tries to jump on your face and suck you further into VR. Then a little bit later in the level, you fight zombies, and they are basically just null bodies with more health, although some of them can shoot blue orbs at you. Sewers, Warehouse, and Central Station all use a mixture of these enemies, and are all very unique environments with awesome and fun interactions in between. Sewers has you come across a melon vault in a world where melons are illegal. Warehouse uses real-time lights to make everything have a really distinct and cool look and destroy your frame rate. And Central Station has this breathtaking moment where you walk to the surface and shows you how close you are to the main goal of the game, the tower. And it also destroys your frame rate as well. Tower is the only vertical level with basically a mini war going on while you get yourself caught up in the middle of it by running through everything, and is many people's favorite level. Time Tower has you fling some balls in a machine, which for a first time player confuses the shit out of them and makes you wondering just what the hell is going on. Dungeon makes you question it even more as you see these clones of yourself walking around and all acting the same, and one even copies your every move. Arena has you fight off zombies for the chance to 1v1 the king, who's also a clone of you, and then the final boss of the game is that you fight with your clone. It's a very weird and puzzling game in the coolest fucking way possible. It feels like there's so much going on, yet you have no idea what any of it means, and just makes you want to dive deeper and figure out why melons are banned. Who are these void guys? Why are the zombies called forward early exits? Why are there clones of me? And what the fuck happened to the dog from Dutch season? Needless to say, I love this game. Stress Level Zero's worry from before release, where the levels were too short, wound up catching them by surprise, as the main complaint with Boneworks was actually that the levels were too long with no checkpoints. Alongside that issue though, the game invoked motion sickness in a lot of people that made it unplayable for them. Due to the fast-paced, high-octane movement of Boneworks, some people simply couldn't handle it and still can't handle the game, unfortunately. Because of this, a group of people, albeit small, straight up couldn't enjoy the game at all. And there's not really anything that can be done about this, because everything Boneworks is built off of kind of instantly directly conflicts with the main idea of preventing motion sickness in VR. Regardless though, Stress Level Zero wasn't done yet. After the game's release, the team was going to try and improve the game to get more people able to enjoy it, and release new content for completely free to make the title even more enticing than it already was. The first update that would come to Boneworks would be save points, which is pretty funny considering one of the people on the SLZ team, Alex Knoll, previously said such a thing would be basically impossible.
First thing we did after launch is look at like what's holding things back, and there was a couple like stuff we were able to do in the first couple days, but the big one was save points. I drew a triangle right there. That's the triangle. So we have the people who aren't having the experience that we want them to have, right? That would be the people like they're like, oh, I want to play this game, but it's too far in between save points, right? We heard you guys loud and clear.
This first update would be a relatively small one, introducing custom brawls to the game where you could choose which NPCs would show up in arena mode. The other thing added, other than some new spawnable props, was work towards Boneworks' core. Things like the interactions would get improved, at least a tad bit, and this would usually be the case each update. At the time, this looked like the only updates we'd be getting, but we would be woefully mistaken in due time. The next update we got was a major content update featuring the Tuscany sandbox, which was originally an Oculus Store exclusive update, and then the redacted chamber from all the teasers before launch. We also got the handgun range, which is an entire time trial focused on the new pistol added. This was all in just one update. Tuscany to this day is still probably the fan favorite sandbox map. Redacted chamber is a personal favorite of mine, and I know people go crazy for the handgun trial and music that came along with it. Going on in the background of these game updates was an upcoming modding scene with a whole gigantic amount of stuff going on in that community alone, which I'll save for the next chapter, but just remember that what I talk about in the next chapter was going on along the same time as these updates. The last two updates would be the Zombie Warehouse Arena, inspired by COD Zombies, and a Hoverjunker Sandbox, where you could fly a plane, kind of. And that would be the end of Boneworks getting updates. Overall, Boneworks had exactly the type of content you'd hope for a game to have. Released fully finished with plenty of content, and yet still received free content updates for just over a year. The life cycle of Boneworks went extremely smoothly and led to people wanting more, since only Boneworks could give this type of experience. So, the community took it into their own hands to get more content from Boneworks by making it themselves, instead of waiting 2 years for the next game by Stress Level 0. It all started with a site called BoneTome. This was the place for people to download and upload Boneworks mods. People would make all sorts of things, like code mods, custom items, weapons, all of which had to be made without any tools provided by SLZ, not only because the game didn't have a focus on modding, but because SLZ actually hated modding, but we'll get back to that. BoneTome would later shut down, so that all mods could migrate to the much more commonly known Thunderstore, which at the time was lacking in a couple of ways, most notably the file size limit. BoneTome had a larger file size cap than Thunderstore did, but that has since been changed. However, what hasn't been changed, and still was better back when BoneTome was around, was the UI. The interface of BoneTome was much cleaner and easier to work with compared to Thunderstore. A little bit later in the modding community lifetime, there was a multiplayer mod released simply called Boneworks Multiplayer. This mod would allow people to play together, sort of. It was nowhere near as fleshed out and polished as BoneLab Fusion is, but rather had multiplayer similar to what I like to call ghost players, where the position of players could be seen, but they couldn't actually interact with your world. This was until the mod Boneworks Entanglement released, made by a group of people, one of those people being Lakatraz, who would later go on to make BoneLab Fusion. Entanglement also wasn't very good. It was a step up in terms of letting players interact with each other's worlds to a certain degree, but it was chock full of unfinished features, bugs, and other miscellaneous problems.
Oh, that's fair.
What the fuck?! Regardless of its issues though, I still fucking loved this mod. Every day I got home from school, I'd spent it excitedly running to my PC to check what wacky mods released, so I could join a public entanglement lobby and watch none of it sink in pure amazement that there were other players in my game at all. On Steam, I have somewhere around 300 hours of playtime on Boneworks, and I can guarantee you no more than 20 of those hours were spent unmodded. As soon as I started modding this game, Boneworks and Pavlov became the only two VR games worth playing to me. And of course, the obligatory Beat Saber playtime. Modding this game was an absolute fever dream that gives an experience BoneLab still can't quite capture due to its limited SDK. Every mod in Boneworks felt like a mystery box of new surprises, since the mods could be basically anything. While in BoneLab, you don't get nearly this same feeling, because if you know enough about the SDK, you know there's not a whole lot that can be done without the extended SDK. And yes, I know this is the way it has to be, and I'm also not saying you can't make good mods in BoneLab, but rather that quality mods were just a lot more common during the Boneworks modding era. These mods are also where BabaCorp first released a version of 7-Eleven, much different to the one that would later be made in BoneLab. Modding Boneworks was like a whole extra experience to the game you could only get by modding it. But SLZ was not a fan for a variety of reasons. For starters, apparently injecting your game with Melon Loader, a necessary tool to mod Boneworks, would result in your memory profile for the game being permanently changed and cause performance issues even if you uninject Melon Loader. Whether this is true? I have literally no idea. From what I've looked up, people are either swearing it does or it doesn't. But regardless, SLZ seemed to be strong on the yes it does side of the spectrum and would immediately decline helping anyone who had their game modded. This meant people saying, this bug is in the game. Someone asking, is your game modded? That person going, no, my game's not modded. Then them being asked if it's ever been modded. The other person going, yeah, 6 months ago I installed Melon Loader, then got rid of it instantly. And instantly getting hit with, okay, well, you're absolutely unhelpable then. Even if the bug was actually a part of the base game, which usually it was. There's also rumors of SLZ even going as far as to make one of the beta branch passwords for Boneworks, mods are bad, but that could very well be untrue and is purely a rumor as far as I know. Regardless of all of this, modding for Boneworks still went very strong and had tons to do in it and genuinely gave me some of the most fun in video games I've ever had. Regardless of the fact that one of the top modders at the time, Darkswitch Pro, was a kid diddler. He now goes by Pointless VR and uploads shit like this.
I figured out a way to record without any hands. You do have to be a boy though. I figured out something for the girls. And
Boneworks was an experience like no other game. Nothing else ever made for consumers could make you feel this in the experience. This game single-handedly changed the way I and many others saw VR. It went from feeling like VR would sometimes limit the experience to showing us that it could enhance it in crazy new ways that absolutely could never be done without a headset. It also showed that VR as a technology was capable of these insane games and just needed devs to actually push the hardware. The reason reviewers constantly talk about a VR game's mechanics and interactability nowadays is largely because Boneworks showed us what could be and should be. This game showed me and thousands of others what a VR game should be, and I couldn't be happier to have had the awesome opportunity to play it at release and when entanglement was still around. Stress Level 0, you made something unfathomably mind-blowing, and if you're watching, I hope you know that. Because seriously, this is not only my favorite VR game of all time, but just my general favorite ever made. Get ready! I got it! Pull up! Pull up!
I got you!
Yeah!
Kunai.
The Spider-Man mod is just so much fun and definitely one of my favorite mods.
What the fuck? Mod Showcase Monday. That's right. I don't only do mod showcases for playing sorcery.
Oh my god, what is that? What is that?
Good. Where'd it go?
This video, as you can tell, definitely took me a fat ass minute, so please help me out by watching my last video where I show off one of these Boneworks mods that I loved very much that showed a lot of the potential of Boneworks maps. And if you're more interested in these sort of gigantic type of videos, you can check out my video on Desert Bus called Beating VR's Hardest Game, where I play through the whole game and give this whole philosophical thing about it. Thank you so very much for watching this video to the end, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye.